They thought they were going to die. All 174 passengers accepted their fate as the plane fell from the sky. Then a quiet woman stood up and did the impossible. She flew the broken plane like a weapon of war. Fighter jets came to watch the crash. Instead, they saw a miracle that terrified them. The pilots checked her name and went silent. The legend they studied in training had been sitting in seat 23C. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 777 cruised through crystalline air at 30,000 feet, its twin engines humming their eternal mechanical prayer while 274 souls breathed recycled atmosphere and dreamed of destinations. In seat 23C, she sat with practiced invisibility, her face angled toward a paperback thriller whose pages turned at intervals calibrated to suggest ordinary engagement rather than the constant tactical awareness that had kept her alive through situations where most would have died screaming. The flight attendants had passed her twice without their eyes focusing, their professional smiles aimed at the space she occupied rather than at her specifically, exactly as she preferred. The businessman beside her had attempted conversation during boarding, made 3 comments about weather and connections, then forgotten her completely when she responded with pleasant vagueness and returned attention to her book. Perfect. She'd perfected this anonymity over countless flights, countless hotels, countless cities where she moved like smoke through crowds that never quite saw her despite looking directly at her face. Her name was Alex Kincaid, though almost nobody called her that anymore, and the casual clothes she wore, jeans, comfortable sneakers, a plain gray sweater, concealed the kind of physical conditioning that turned bodies into precision instruments. She was 38 years old and looked ordinary enough that security personnel waved her through checkpoints without second glances, that gate agents processed her boarding pass without recognition flickering behind their professional courtesy. She'd been flying since she was 19, had accumulated more hours in military cockpits than most commercial pilots logged in entire careers, had earned a call sign that made hardened fighter jocks straighten their spines when it was spoken in ready rooms and briefing spaces. But none of that showed in seat 23C, where she appeared to be simply another passenger counting the hours until landing, another traveler occupying the anonymous space between departure and arrival. The first indication that something was wrong came as a tremor through the airframe, subtle enough that most passengers didn't consciously register it but significant enough that Alex's body responded before her conscious mind processed the information. Her fingers tightened fractionally on her book while her eyes tracked sideways toward the wing visible through the window, watching for asymmetric behavior or control surface anomalies. The tremor came again, accompanied this time by a sound that existed at the edge of hearing, metal stress, hydraulic pressure fluctuation, something in the aircraft's mechanical symphony playing a note that didn't belong. She closed her book slowly, her expression remaining carefully neutral while her mind began running through system architectures and failure cascades with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent 20 years studying how machines died. The captain's voice came over the intercom, professionally calm but with an undertone that Alex recognized immediately as controlled fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking. We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties and will be descending to a lower altitude as a precautionary measure. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." The words were carefully chosen to avoid panic, but Alex heard what wasn't being said, the stress fractures in his voice, the slight hesitation before minor technical difficulties, the way he'd said precautionary, with the emphasis of someone trying to convince himself as much as his passengers. She'd used that same tone herself once, over Bosnia, when her F-16 had taken a missile fragment through the hydraulics and she'd needed her wingman to stay calm while she figured out whether she was riding the jet down or ejecting into hostile territory. The descent began too steeply, the nose dropping with an urgency that contradicted the captain's reassuring words. Passengers began murmuring, nervous laughter mixing with concerned questions as the aircraft's behavior exceeded normal parameters. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with fixed smiles, checking seatbelts and securing loose items, but Alex could see the fear bleeding through their training, the way one attendant's hands shook slightly as she reached for an overhead bin, the way another kept glancing toward the cockpit with an expression that suggested she'd received information from the flight deck that contradicted the captain's public announcements. The businessman beside Alex gripped his armrests, knuckles whitening, and across the aisle a mother pulled her daughter closer with protective instinct that recognized danger even when the mind refused to name it. Then the aircraft rolled hard left, 30 degrees of bank angle appearing without warning and accompanied by a shudder that ran through the entire structure like a living thing convulsing. Overhead bins rattled, carry-on luggage shifted despite being stowed, and the wing visible through Alex's window dipped toward Earth with the kind of aggressive movement that didn't belong to commercial aviation's careful choreography. People screamed. The flight attendants grabbed for support, their professional composure fracturing as the aircraft's behavior crossed the line from concerning to terrifying. Alex's mind processed the roll with clinical precision: control surface malfunction, probably multiple hydraulic failures, the pilot's fighting systems that were no longer responding to input with predictable results. She'd felt this before, had lived through variations of this particular emergency, knew exactly how quickly it could cascade from manageable to catastrophic if the people in the cockpit didn't have the right training and the right instincts and the right experience with flying broken machines. The aircraft recovered from the roll but began porpoising, nose pitching up and down in oscillations that suggested the pilots were fighting an aircraft that had stopped obeying the fundamental principles of aerodynamic stability. The captain came back on the intercom, his voice now stripped of pretense. "This is Captain Morrison. We are declaring an emergency. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Passengers, listen carefully to your flight attendants and follow their instructions exactly." The click as he terminated the announcement was followed by chaos, passengers crying, shouting, praying, the fabric of social order disintegrating as 174 people simultaneously realized they might be minutes away from violent death. The businessman beside Alex was hyperventilating, his face gray with terror, and throughout the cabin the same scene repeated itself in countless variations, each passenger confronting their mortality with whatever psychological resources they possessed. Alex remained completely still, her body relaxed against the seat while her mind worked through the emergency with the clarity that came from having survived situations where hesitation measured the difference between life and death. She recognized this failure cascade, had studied it in classified briefings, had trained against it in simulators, knew that commercial pilots typically had about 90 seconds of training on this particular combination of hydraulic failures before the scenario was abandoned as too catastrophic to be worth extensive practice. The pilots up front would be following emergency checklists, trying procedures designed for single-system failures while dealing with multiple simultaneous malfunctions that turned their training into suggestions rather than solutions. They were good pilots, she could tell from how they were managing the aircraft's increasingly violent behavior, but they were operating at the edge of their professional knowledge and running out of options. She could stay in her seat. She could maintain her carefully constructed anonymity, could remain invisible while the aircraft died around her, could preserve the civilian life she'd built over the last 3 years by letting the emergency resolve itself according to whatever statistical probability governed commercial aviation disasters. 174 people would die, but they'd die without her true identity becoming exposed, without the media attention and military debriefings and congressional inquiries that would follow if she intervened. She could keep her secrets. She could stay hidden. The thought lasted approximately 2 seconds before her body was already moving, seatbelt releasing, hands gripping the seat backs as she made her way forward against the aircraft's pitching motion. The forward galley was chaos, flight attendants huddled together, one crying openly, another speaking urgently into the interphone while trying to reach the cockpit. Alex touched the nearest attendant's shoulder, her voice calm and absolutely certain. "I need you to get me into the cockpit right now. I'm a pilot. I can help." The attendant stared at her with incomprehension, shock overriding normal decision-making processes, so Alex repeated herself with the kind of command authority that made people's bodies obey before their minds caught up. "Open the cockpit door. Now. Tell them Captain Kincaid is coming through. They're running out of time and I'm their only option." The attendant fumbled with the interphone, spoke rapid words Alex couldn't hear over the aircraft's mechanical screaming, then moved to unlock the reinforced door. It swung open to reveal a cockpit drowning in warning lights and alarm bells, 2 pilots fighting controls that responded with the sluggish unpredictability of systems operating beyond their design parameters. The captain, Morrison, gray-haired and sweating through his uniform shirt, glanced back at her with wild eyes. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately. We're in an emergency situation." Alex cut him off with 3 words that made both pilots freeze. "Starboard hydraulics gone." Morrison stared at her, his brain trying to process how a passenger could diagnose his emergency with that precision, and Alex used his hesitation to slide into the cockpit, pulling the door shut behind her. "Complete hydraulic failure on the right system, partial failure on the left, and you're getting asymmetric control responses that are about 30 seconds away from sending this aircraft into an unrecoverable spiral. Your training says to isolate the failed systems and fly on backup hydraulics, but that's not going to work because the cascading failures are affecting your backup systems faster than you can compensate. You need to stop following the checklist and start flying this like a combat aircraft with battle damage." She delivered the assessment in 15 seconds, her voice cutting through the chaos with the absolute certainty of someone who'd lived through variations of this scenario and survived. The co-pilot, younger and clearly terrified, found his voice. "Who the hell are you?" Alex ignored him, her attention focused on the captain, reading the man's face for the decision she needed him to make. Morrison was good, she could see it in how his hands never stopped working the controls even while his mind processed this impossible situation, could see it in how he'd kept the aircraft flying this long despite system failures that should have killed them already. But good wasn't going to be enough. He needed to make a choice that violated every protocol he'd been taught, needed to hand tactical control of his aircraft to a stranger who claimed expertise he couldn't verify while 174 lives depended on him making the right decision in the next 10 seconds. "You're a passenger," Morrison said, his voice fighting for control. "Even if you're a pilot, you're not type-rated on this aircraft, you don't know my systems," Alex interrupted him with technical precision that made both pilots freeze. "Boeing 777-300ER, you're losing hydraulic pressure in Systems 1 and 3 while System 2 is operating at 40% capacity. Your left elevator is responding but with a lag that suggests actuator damage, your right elevator is completely unresponsive, and you're fighting aileron asymmetry that's going to induce a Dutch roll if you keep trying to correct with standard inputs. You've got about 90 seconds before this aircraft becomes unflyable, and your emergency procedures don't cover this combination of failures because it's not supposed to be survivable." Morrison's face transformed, fear mixing with desperate hope as he recognized that her assessment matched exactly what he was experiencing. "How do you know?" Alex moved beside him, her hands hovering near the controls without touching them, her voice dropping into the calm cadence she'd used in combat when talking wingmen through emergencies. "Captain, I'm going to give you instructions that will sound insane. You're going to want to question them because they violate everything you've been taught about flying this aircraft safely. But I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it, or everyone on this plane dies. Can you do that?" The aircraft lurched violently, the nose pitching down 15 degrees while the right wing dropped in a motion that suggested the beginning of the spiral Alex had predicted. Morrison made his decision in the space between heartbeats, his hands relaxing fractionally on the yoke as he nodded once. "Tell me what you need." Alex's response came immediately, her tactical mind already 3 moves ahead. "Release back pressure slowly, let the nose drop another 5 degrees. I know every instinct is screaming at you to pull up, but we need to trade altitude for control authority. Reduce power on your number 2 engine by 15% to compensate for the asymmetric control response." Morrison followed her instructions with the precision of someone who'd spent 30 years learning to trust his aircraft systems, his hands moving exactly as she directed despite the violation of everything his training insisted was correct. The aircraft's behavior changed. Immediately, the violent pitching reduced, the wing roll stabilized, and for the first time in 3 minutes the machine responded to input with something approaching predictable results. The co-pilot was staring at Alex with an expression caught between terror and awe, his hands frozen on his controls as he watched her guide Morrison through procedures that seemed to be pulled from nowhere but which were producing results that normal emergency protocols hadn't achieved. "Now increase power on 1 and 3, bring them up slowly to 90%. Alex's voice remained absolutely steady, her attention divided between the instrument panel and the view through the windscreen, processing information streams with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent 2 decades reading emergencies in the microsecond movements of needles and digital displays. You're getting differential thrust that's going to help stabilize the roll tendency, but you need to stay ahead of it with rudder input. Small corrections, smooth and constant, don't try to force the aircraft back to level, let it find its own equilibrium and guide it there. Morrison was sweating heavily, his uniform soaked through, but his hands moved with increasing confidence as he felt the aircraft responding to inputs that his training had never prepared him for. "This is working," he said, his voice carrying equal parts disbelief and desperate relief. "I don't understand how this is working, but it's actually working." Alex allowed herself a fractional smile, the first break in her tactical focus since entering the cockpit. "You're flying this machine like a broken fighter jet now instead of a commercial aircraft. Your safety margins are gone, your redundant systems are compromised, and every control input has a 3-second lag before you see results. But if you stay smooth and stay ahead of the failure cascade, you can keep it flying long enough to get these people on the ground." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Morrison's career, each second requiring absolute concentration as he flew the crippled aircraft through a descent that violated every standard procedure while simultaneously proving that Alex's tactical approach was the only thing preventing complete catastrophic failure. She stood beside him throughout, her voice providing a constant stream of guidance that anticipated problems before they appeared, adjusted for failures before instruments registered them, kept him 3 steps ahead of an aircraft that was trying to kill everyone aboard. The co-pilot handled communications, declaring their emergency to air traffic control, coordinating emergency services, receiving vectors toward the nearest suitable airport while Alex and Morrison fought to keep the 777 controllable. "United 447, we're showing you're off course and continuing to descend. Can you confirm your status?" The controller's voice carried professional concern mixed with barely suppressed alarm, and the co-pilot responded with updates that painted a picture of an aircraft that shouldn't still be flying. Alex monitored the radio traffic peripherally, hearing the controller scrambling resources, clearing airspace, preparing for an emergency that had every indication of ending in disaster. She'd heard that same controlled urgency before, in combat situations where controllers watched aircraft they couldn't help and prepared themselves for the radio calls that would never come. Then Morrison said something that made her tactical focus fracture momentarily. "Control is requesting military support. They're vectoring F-35s from the air defense sector to escort us in." Alex's expression didn't change, but something cold moved through her chest, the first intrusion of her hidden identity into a situation she'd been managing as a purely civilian emergency. The F-35s would have secure communications, would be plugged into military databases, would have access to information that commercial controllers couldn't reach. They would see the emergency, would monitor the aircraft's approach, and if things went wrong they would witness the end with tactical precision that civilian radar couldn't provide. "Tell them we copy," Alex said, her voice remaining steady while her mind calculated new variables. "Military escort is appreciated but we need clear approach corridors and emergency services standing by." Morrison glanced at her with renewed curiosity, something in her response suggesting familiarity with military protocols that went beyond civilian pilot training, but the aircraft chose that moment to develop a new oscillation and his attention snapped back to the controls. Alex guided him through the compensation, her hands still hovering near the yoke, ready to take over if his training failed him but trusting his experience to implement her instructions with the precision they required. The F-35s appeared off their right wing 10 minutes later, 2 angular shapes sliding into formation with the kind of effortless precision that suggested pilots who flew these positions in their sleep. Alex saw them through the cockpit window, those familiar lines triggering memories she'd spent 3 years trying to leave behind, the weight of a helmet, the pressure of a G-suit during hard turns, the particular quality of light at 40,000 feet where the sky turned colors that didn't exist at ground level. She'd flown formations like this herself, had escorted crippled aircraft, had talked damaged birds toward emergency landings while calculating whether they'd make it or whether she'd be witnessing deaths she couldn't prevent. The F-35 pilots were doing that now, watching her aircraft, assessing its behavior, preparing to document whatever happened next. "United 447, Lightning 21 has you visual. We're with you all the way down. The F-35 pilot's voice came through the radio with the calm professionalism that was universal among military aviators, and Alex recognized the undertone of respect that fighter pilots reserved for commercial crews dealing with emergencies that exceeded normal training. They thought they were escorting a commercial crew struggling heroically against impossible circumstances. They had no idea who was actually flying the aircraft, had no reason to suspect that the tactical approaches Morrison was using came from someone whose expertise exceeded their own in specific ways. The landing gear became the next crisis. The hydraulic failures meant the gear had to be extended using the backup systems, and even those were compromised by the cascading malfunctions that had turned the aircraft into a machine held together by physics and determination rather than engineering redundancy. Alex talked Morrison through the gear extension, monitoring the indicators as the wheels deployed with agonizing slowness, only 2 of 3 showing green lights initially before the third finally locked with a mechanical thunk they could feel through the airframe. "Gear down and locked," Morrison reported, his voice carrying exhaustion mixed with fragile hope. "We might actually survive this." "Might is doing a lot of work in that sentence," Alex replied, allowing herself a moment of dark humor that made the co-pilot laugh despite everything, a brief sound that released some of the impossible tension filling the cockpit. The airport was visible now, runways lit like a beacon in the approaching dusk, emergency vehicles already staged and waiting for an arrival that might be landing or might be controlled crash depending on variables nobody could predict. Alex had Morrison begin the final approach high and fast, trading altitude and airspeed for control authority, preparing to grease the landing with techniques that were more tactical recovery than commercial procedure. That's when the F-35 pilot's voice came back on the radio, but now addressing someone else, using a frequency that Alex recognized as military secure communications that somehow was bleeding through to the commercial radio. "Control, Lightning 21. Can you confirm the passenger assist reported by United 447? We're showing tactical approaches that are unusual for commercial operations." There was a pause, and then another voice, ground-based military operations, responded with information that made Alex's heart stop. "Lightning 21, stand by. We're pulling the flight manifest now and cross-referencing with military databases for passenger authorization to assist with emergency operations." Morrison glanced at Alex with sudden sharp attention, questions forming behind his eyes, but she kept her focus locked forward, her voice maintaining the same steady guidance. "Start reducing power on final, we need to be at approach speed before we cross the threshold. Your left engine is going to spool down slower than normal, so compensate early." He followed her instructions, his hands moving automatically now, trusting her completely even as his mind processed what the military communications suggested. The co-pilot was staring at Alex openly, his professional composure abandoned in favor of raw curiosity mixed with dawning understanding. The aircraft descended through 2,000 feet, still responding to inputs but with decreasing reliability as systems continued degrading toward complete failure. The runway expanded ahead of them, emergency vehicles tracking their approach, and Alex could see fire crews standing ready with the expectation that this aircraft might not stay on the runway or might arrive harder than any landing was meant to be survived. Morrison's breathing was fast and shallow, his body tensed against the controls, and Alex knew he was feeling the aircraft beneath him like a dying animal, understanding viscerally that they were seconds away from either salvation or disaster. 500 feet, the co-pilot called, his voice mechanical with focus. 400.300. The runway rushed up toward them, concrete and lights and the finite space where this emergency would resolve one way or another. Alex's guidance dropped to single words: power. Nose. Smooth. Each syllable timed to keep Morrison ahead of the aircraft's responses, her tactical mind processing the landing with the precision of someone who put damaged aircraft onto carrier decks at night in weather that would have grounded commercial aviation. Morrison flared perfectly, the nose rising as the main gear kissed the runway with a chirp of rubber that was probably the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard, and then they were down, rolling, decelerating, alive. The cockpit erupted in sound, alarms wailing their protests, warnings screaming about systems that no longer mattered because they were on the ground and the wheels were staying attached and people were going to walk off this aircraft instead of being carried off in whatever pieces physics left behind. Morrison was laughing, tears streaming down his face, his hands shaking so badly he could barely maintain directional control as emergency vehicles paced them down the runway. The co-pilot was praying, his voice choked with emotion, and throughout the cabin behind them 174 passengers were experiencing the particular joy that came from accepting death and then having it rescinded at the last possible second. Alex allowed herself one long breath, tension draining from her body, before the F-35 pilot's voice returned on the secure frequency that was still somehow bleeding through. Ground control, Lightning 21. That was tactical carrier approach methodology adapted for commercial airframe. Whoever talked them down used military emergency procedures I've only seen in classified briefings. Can you confirm the identity on that passenger assist? There was a longer pause this time, and Alex knew exactly what was happening in whatever operations center was monitoring this situation. They were pulling her name from the manifest, running it through databases, finding flags and restrictions and classifications that would make someone's screen light up with alerts. They were discovering who she actually was, were cross-referencing her current civilian identity with her military service record, were realizing that the ordinary passenger who'd saved United 447 wasn't ordinary at all. The silence stretched for 15 seconds that felt like hours, and then the operations controller's voice came back with an undertone of absolute shock. Lightning 21, passenger assist is confirmed as. Christ. Lightning 21, you're not going to believe this, but passenger assist is Viper. Repeat, Viper. The radio went dead silent. Not the silence of nobody talking, but the silence of people who just heard something that made them forget how to form words. Alex closed her eyes briefly, hearing her call sign spoken in that tone, the reverent shock reserved for legends whose names appeared in training materials and whose accomplishments shaped doctrine. Viper. She hadn't heard herself called that in 3 years, hadn't worn the identity in public since she'd resigned her commission and disappeared into the civilian world where nobody knew what she'd done or who she'd been. Morrison turned to stare at her, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten in shock. Viper, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. You're Viper. The Viper. Bosnia, Syria, Taiwan Straits, Alex held up a hand, stopping him, her face carefully neutral. Right now I'm just a passenger who helped out during an emergency. That's all. But she could see in his eyes that it was far too late for that particular fiction, could see him reprocessing everything that had happened through the lens of her true identity, understanding now why her guidance had saved them when it shouldn't have been possible. The F-35 pilot came back on the radio, his voice transformed by recognition. Viper, Lightning 21. It's an honor, ma'am. We've studied your tactics at the academy. That landing was beautiful. 174 souls saved by the best stick to ever fly combat operations. Welcome home. The simple phrase carried weight that made Alex's throat tight, welcome home, as though saving a commercial aircraft had somehow pulled her back into the community she'd left behind, as though 3 years of anonymity had been erased by 30 minutes of emergency procedures. Lightning 21, thanks for the escort, she replied, using the radio for the first time, her voice carrying the particular inflection that military pilots used when communicating with each other, the subtle markers of shared experience and mutual respect. Appreciate you guys keeping an eye on us. Tell your controller that Viper needs about 6 months before this gets reported anywhere official. Some of us are trying to stay retired. The request was impossible, there would be investigations, debriefings, media attention, congressional medals, but she had to try, had to make the attempt to preserve some fragment of the anonymous life she'd built. The F-35 pilot's response carried rueful sympathy. Copy that, Viper. I'll pass it along, but I think that particular cat is way out of the bag. You just saved 174 lives at 30,000 feet using tactics that are going to be studied for the next 50 years. Pretty sure the whole world's going to know your name by tomorrow morning. He was right, she knew. The moment operations had confirmed her identity, the moment her call sign had been spoken on recorded frequencies, her anonymity had become impossible to maintain. She'd traded her invisible life for the survival of everyone on this aircraft, and the price was exposure she'd spent 3 years avoiding. The aircraft finally rolled to a stop on the taxiway, surrounded by emergency vehicles whose lights painted the interior of the cockpit in alternating red and white. Morrison shut down the engines with hands that still trembled, securing systems that had somehow held together long enough despite having no business remaining operational. He turned to Alex with an expression that combined gratitude, awe, and a dozen questions he didn't know how to ask. "Captain Kincaid," he started, and she smiled slightly at his use of her rank. "Just Alex," she corrected gently. "I'm not wearing the uniform anymore, remember?" "Alex," he amended, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been flying for 30 years. I've handled emergencies, I've trained for scenarios like this, and I'm telling you with absolute certainty that we should all be dead right now. Those failures, that combination of malfunctions, there's no procedure that saves us from that. Except apparently there is, if you happen to have the most legendary combat pilot in modern military aviation history sitting in seat 23C. His eyes were red, tears threatening again, and Alex understood the particular gratitude of someone who'd been given back a life they'd already lost. "Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it, but thank you." Alex gripped his shoulder briefly, the gesture carrying more meaning than words could express. "You did the flying, Captain. I just gave you some tactical suggestions. That landing was all you." It wasn't quite true, her guidance had been the difference between survival and disaster, but he needed to hear it, needed to process this emergency as something he'd accomplished rather than something he'd survived through luck and outside intervention. The co-pilot was staring at both of them, his mind clearly still trying to reconcile the ordinary passenger with the legendary pilot, and Alex read the questions forming behind his shock. The cabin door opened, flight attendants appearing with faces that showed people who'd survived trauma they'd never adequately process, and behind them passengers were standing, cheering, crying, holding each other with the desperate relief of people who'd touched death and been allowed to step back. They didn't know yet who'd saved them, didn't understand that the woman standing in the cockpit represented expertise that exceeded civilian aviation's wildest capabilities. They just knew they were alive, and their gratitude filled the aircraft like a physical presence. Alex moved through the cabin toward the forward exit, trying to maintain some fraction of anonymity even though she knew it was futile. Passengers reached out to touch her, to thank her, their faces carrying emotions too complex to name. The businessman from 23C gripped her hand, his eyes wet. "You saved us," he said simply, his voice carrying the particular quality of truth that needed no elaboration. "Whatever else happens, whatever your story is, you saved my life today. My daughter gets to see her father again because of you." Alex nodded, unable to find adequate words, and continued moving toward the exit where emergency responders were waiting. She stepped out into chaos, fire crews and paramedics and airport officials, all moving with the organized urgency that followed any major emergency. But there was something else too, a cluster of military personnel in flight suits who'd appeared with the speed that suggested they'd been scrambled the moment her identity was confirmed. They stood at attention as she descended the stairs, their posture carrying the respect that elite pilots reserved for others who'd proven themselves in circumstances where proof meant survival against impossible odds. A colonel stepped forward, his face showing someone who'd clearly been woken from sleep and driven here at speeds that civilian traffic laws didn't contemplate. "Captain Kincaid," he said formally, using her rank despite her civilian clothes. "I'm Colonel Marcus Webb, Deputy Commander of the Tactical Air Wing. I've been instructed by Pacific Air Forces Command to extend their gratitude for your actions tonight and to request your cooperation with the investigation that's going to follow." His tone was respectful but carried undertones suggesting this request was actually a military order disguised in polite language. Alex looked at him for a long moment, reading the situation with the tactical clarity that had kept her alive through 20 years of service. "Colonel, I'm a civilian now. I don't take orders from Pacific Air Forces or anyone else with stars on their shoulders. I helped with an emergency because people needed help, not because I'm still part of your command structure." Her voice was calm but carried absolute certainty, drawing a boundary that she needed him to acknowledge. Webb's expression shifted, showing someone recalculating their approach, and he nodded slowly. Fair enough, he conceded. Then let me rephrase. We would be deeply grateful if you would consent to answering some questions about what happened up there, because the preliminary reports suggest you used tactical procedures that we're very interested in understanding. Not for discipline or oversight, but because you apparently just demonstrated emergency techniques that could save lives in future situations. His reframing was skillful, appealing to her desire to help rather than her obligation to serve, and Alex recognized the manipulation even while appreciating his honesty about it. I'll cooperate with reasonable debriefings, she said carefully. But I need your word that this doesn't become a media circus or a congressional hearing or an excuse to drag me back into service. I left for reasons that are still valid, and saving one aircraft doesn't change that. Webb studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod with what looked like genuine sympathy. You have my word, Captain. Whatever your reasons were for leaving, they're yours to keep. We just want to learn from what you did tonight. The passengers were disembarking now, some walking, some being carried by paramedics who were checking for injuries that adrenaline might be concealing. Alex watched them, counting faces, confirming that all 174 souls had survived the emergency intact. A woman approached her, middle-aged and carrying a child who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Are you the one who saved us? The woman asked, her voice breaking. The flight attendant said a passenger helped the pilots, and I need to know who to thank for my daughter's life. Alex looked at the child, seeing large eyes and an expression of innocent curiosity unmarred by understanding of how close death had come. The pilots saved us, she said gently, redirecting the gratitude toward Morrison and his crew. They did an amazing job under impossible circumstances. But the woman wasn't accepting the deflection, her eyes seeing past the casual clothes to something deeper. You're military, aren't you? The way you stand, the way you talk, you're someone important. Please, I just need to know your name so I can tell my daughter who saved her mother's life. Before Alex could respond, one of the F-35 pilots appeared at her elbow, younger than her, probably mid-20s, his face showing the particular mixture of confidence and humility that characterized fighter pilots who'd proven themselves in combat. Ma'am, he said, his voice carrying formality despite their relative ranks being unclear in this civilian context. I'm Captain Tyler Morrison, Lightning 21. I wanted to thank you in person for what you did up there. I was watching that approach, and I've never seen a more perfect execution of battle damage procedures adapted to commercial operations. You saved every single person on that aircraft through tactics that most pilots wouldn't even consider attempting. His words carried across the space, reaching passengers who were beginning to cluster around them, curiosity mixing with gratitude as they understood that this exchange involved the person who'd been responsible for their survival. Alex saw her anonymity dissolving in real time, saw the moment when individual recognition transformed into collective awareness, and knew there was no putting this particular genie back in its bottle. The woman with the child was staring at her with new intensity, recognition flickering in her eyes. You're Viper, she said, the name carrying a weight that suggested she'd heard it before, probably in news reports or documentaries. Oh my God. You're Viper. The name rippled through the crowd, passengers repeating it to each other, pulling out phones to search for information that would explain why that particular call sign carried such significance. Alex watched it happen with the resignation of someone who'd known this exposure was inevitable from the moment she'd decided to enter that cockpit. Her anonymous life was over, sacrificed in exchange for 174 survivors who would never have existed if she'd chosen to preserve her invisibility. It was a trade she'd make again, but that didn't make the loss feel any less profound. Captain Tyler Morrison, the F-35 pilot, no relation to the commercial captain, was looking at her with undisguised admiration. Ma'am, I'm curious about something. That tactical approach you used, adapting carrier landing methodology to a compromised commercial airframe, that's not in any training manual I've ever seen. Where did you learn that? His question was professional curiosity mixed with the desire to understand how legends developed the expertise that made them legendary, and Alex recognized the familiar pattern of younger pilots trying to extract lessons from veterans who'd survived situations where survival shouldn't have been possible. "You learn it by flying broken airplanes and not dying," she replied, her voice carrying dark humor that acknowledged the reality beneath the tactics. "Every emergency teaches you something about what machines can survive when conventional wisdom says they can't. You accumulate enough emergencies, you start recognizing patterns that let you push boundaries that normal procedures won't approach. Tonight wasn't innovation, it was just experience applied to a new situation." The explanation simplified complexity that had taken her 20 years to develop, but it was the truth distilled to its essential core. More military personnel were arriving now, including a 3-star general whose helicopter Alex could see landing on a nearby taxiway. The situation was escalating, her involvement transforming from emergency response to something that was going to require official acknowledgement and probably recognition that she didn't want. She could see the trajectory, the media attention, the ceremonies, the inevitable requests for her to consult on training programs or return to active duty. Everything she'd been avoiding for 3 years was about to descend on her life with the inevitability of weather patterns. The general approached with the confidence of someone used to deference, but his eyes when they met Alex's showed genuine respect rather than command authority. "Captain Kincaid," he said, offering his hand. "General Raymond Martinez, Pacific Air Forces. I want to personally thank you for your actions tonight. You've just demonstrated why some people's expertise exceeds what civilian aviation typically recognizes, and you've saved lives in a situation where conventional procedures would have resulted in catastrophic loss. The nation owes you a debt that can't adequately be repaid." Alex shook his hand, reading the subtext beneath his formal gratitude. "General, I appreciate the acknowledgement, but I need you to understand something clearly. I'm retired. I left active service for personal reasons that haven't changed, and tonight's emergency doesn't represent a change in my status. I helped because people needed help, not because I'm available for military operations or public service." Her voice was respectful but absolutely firm, drawing a line she needed him to recognize. Martinez studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted toward understanding. "I respect that, Captain. Your service record speaks for itself, and if you've decided that chapter is closed, that's your right. But I hope you'll at least consent to a proper debriefing, because what you did tonight represents tactical knowledge that could save lives in future emergencies. We'd be foolish not to learn from your expertise." His response was measured, acknowledging her boundary while making a reasonable request, and Alex found herself nodding. "I'll cooperate with a reasonable debriefing," she confirmed. "But after that, I'm going back to my anonymous civilian life, and I need everyone to respect that choice." Even as she said it, she knew how unlikely that outcome was. The media were probably already digging through her service record, passengers were posting on social media, and her face was going to be on every news broadcast by morning. But she had to try, had to make the attempt to preserve some fragment of the life she'd built. The passengers were still watching her, their faces showing a mixture of gratitude and awe that made Alex uncomfortable in ways that combat never had. She'd learned how to face death, how to make impossible decisions under pressure, how to survive situations that killed most people who encountered them. But she'd never learned how to accept public recognition gracefully, had never developed the skills for navigating the particular discomfort of being seen as heroic rather than simply competent. She was just someone who'd accumulated expertise through survival and applied it when circumstances required. The fact that most people didn't have that expertise didn't make her special, it just made her lucky to have lived long enough to develop it. A news crew appeared at the perimeter, cameras already rolling, reporters shouting questions that airport security was trying to contain. Alex saw her last moments of anonymity evaporating in real time, saw the future unfolding with the certainty of physics, the interviews she couldn't avoid, the ceremonies she couldn't decline, the attention she couldn't escape. She'd traded invisibility for 174 lives, and the transaction was complete. There was no going back to being the woman in seat 23C who nobody noticed or remembered. Morrison, the commercial captain, appeared at her side, still unsteady on his feet but determined to reach her. "The crew wants to thank you properly," he said, his voice carrying exhaustion and emotion in equal measure. "We're trying to figure out how to express gratitude for something that exceeds normal human experience. You gave us our lives back, gave all these passengers their futures back, and we don't have words adequate for that." Alex looked at him, seeing a good man processing an impossible day, and felt something shift in her chest, the recognition that perhaps exposure was the price that legends paid for remaining human, that anonymity couldn't be maintained when circumstances required intervention beyond ordinary boundaries. "Captain Morrison, you kept that aircraft flying through failures that should have killed everyone instantly. Your crew managed an impossible situation with professional skill that gave me something to work with. This was teamwork, not heroism." She meant it, needed him to understand that survival had been collaborative rather than individual, but she could see in his eyes that he understood the reality beneath her modesty. Without her intervention, everyone aboard United 447 would have died. That truth was inescapable, and it defined her exposure whether she wanted to acknowledge it or not. The F-35 pilot, Tyler Morrison, was still standing nearby, clearly unwilling to leave without extracting more lessons from someone whose reputation exceeded most pilots' entire careers. "Ma'am, I have to ask, how do you live with it, the burden of having expertise that exceeds what normal situations require? You were sitting in seat 23C, reading a book, trying to be invisible, and then circumstances forced you to reveal capabilities that most people don't possess. How do you reconcile that kind of existence?" His question carried genuine curiosity mixed with the recognition that some people's abilities created obligations that normal life couldn't accommodate. Alex considered the question seriously, recognizing its depth. "You learn to live in the space between who you are and who people see. You develop skills that circumstances required, and then you try to exist normally despite carrying capabilities that normal life doesn't need. Sometimes crisis finds you anyway, and you have to choose between maintaining your invisibility and using your expertise to help. Tonight I chose to help, and the price is losing the anonymity I'd built. I'll pay that price again for the same reasons, but that doesn't make it feel less like loss." Her honesty seemed to resonate with the young pilot, who nodded slowly. "Thank you, ma'am. That's profound. And for what it's worth, I think the world needs to know about people like you. Needs to understand that some individuals possess capabilities that exceed normal boundaries, and that those capabilities exist specifically because circumstances force their development through survival rather than choice. You're not a hero because you wanted to be, you're legendary because you survived situations that killed most people and learned from them." The description was accurate enough that Alex couldn't dispute it, even though it made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't articulate. She'd never sought legend status, had never wanted the particular fame that came from being known for surviving where others died. But expertise developed through survival created obligations whether she wanted them or not, and tonight had proven that anonymity was ultimately impossible when circumstances required intervention that only she could provide. General Martinez returned with a tablet showing preliminary investigation reports, his expression carrying professional concern mixed with bureaucratic necessity. "Captain Kincaid, I need to brief you on what happens next. The FAA is going to require extensive debriefing about the emergency procedures you employed. The Department of Defense is interested in your tactical approaches for potential integration into training programs. Congress is probably going to want to present some form of recognition. And the media, well, the media is going to make you the most famous person in aviation for at least the next month. Are you prepared for that level of attention?" Alex looked at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of exposure settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "No," she said honestly. "I'm not prepared for it, didn't want it, and would give almost anything to return to being invisible. But I understand that choice was made the moment I entered that cockpit, and I'll handle whatever consequences follow because the alternative was letting 174 people die. So brief me on the requirements, tell me what cooperation is mandatory versus optional, and help me navigate this in ways that minimize the disruption to the civilian life I've built." Martinez's expression softened, showing sympathy that suggested he understood more than his rank might indicate. "I'll do what I can to protect your privacy and minimize the circus, Captain. You have my word on that. But you need to understand that what you did tonight was extraordinary enough that no amount of management is going to keep it quiet. You saved 174 lives using tactics that are going to be studied for decades. That kind of expertise combined with that kind of outcome creates legend whether you want it or not." He was right, she knew. Legends weren't chosen, they emerged from the intersection of extraordinary capability and impossible circumstances, documented by survivors who needed to explain their survival through individual excellence rather than statistical luck. She'd become legendary not through ambition but through the accumulated weight of emergencies survived and lives saved, and tonight had been the exposure that made that legend impossible to conceal. The passengers were beginning to disperse, taken to hotels or hospitals for observation, each carrying their own version of tonight's story. They'd survived because someone extraordinary happened to be in seat 23C, and that truth would define their understanding of the emergency regardless of how Alex tried to frame it. She'd been invisible, and now she was legendary, and the transformation was complete and irreversible. As airport personnel began clearing the scene, as military officers coordinated their debriefings and security personnel managed the media presence, Alex stood for a moment looking at the aircraft that had almost become 174 coffins carried by a metal tube that had stopped obeying the fundamental principles of aerodynamic survival. She'd saved them all, had pulled off an emergency recovery that would be analyzed and discussed and incorporated into training programs for as long as people flew machines through the sky. The price was her anonymity, her carefully constructed civilian existence, her freedom to move through the world unseen. But looking at the faces of survivors as they departed, the businessmen who'd sat beside her, the mother with her young daughter, Captain Morrison and his crew, Alex knew she'd make the same choice again without hesitation. Some things were worth more than anonymity. Some obligations exceeded personal preference. And sometimes the only way to save lives was to sacrifice the invisibility that made civilian existence possible. She was Viper again, whether she wanted to be or not. The call sign she'd left behind had found her at 30,000 feet, had emerged through the emergency procedures that only someone with her expertise could execute, and now it would follow her through whatever came next. The burden of being extraordinary, the cost of possessing capabilities that exceeded normal boundaries, was the loss of the ordinary life she'd built in the 3 years since leaving service. Colonel Webb approached one final time, his expression showing someone who'd been tasked with managing a situation beyond normal parameters. "Captain, we have quarters prepared at the base if you need somewhere to decompress before the debriefings begin. Given the media attention, it might be more comfortable than trying to find a hotel." His offer was thoughtful, acknowledging that tonight's aftermath would require navigation that civilian resources couldn't easily provide. Alex nodded, accepting his hospitality because the alternative was exposure she wasn't ready to handle. "Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate the consideration." She followed him toward a waiting vehicle, leaving behind the aircraft and the passengers and the scene of her exposure. Tomorrow would bring investigations and recognition and media attention that would define her existence for however long the public remained interested in heroes. But tonight she could rest in the knowledge that 174 people were alive who shouldn't be, that her sacrifice of anonymity had purchased futures that would otherwise have ended at 30,000 feet in a catastrophic spiral nobody could survive. She was Viper. She was legendary. She was exhausted and exposed and uncertain about what came next. But she was alive, and so were 174 others who'd boarded United 447 with the ordinary expectation of routine travel. That outcome, purchased with the price of her hidden identity, was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative, maintaining invisibility while passengers died, was a choice she could never have lived with, regardless of what it cost her personal peace. The vehicle pulled away from the airport, leaving behind the emergency lights and military personnel and survivors who would remember this night for the rest of their lives. Alex leaned back against the seat, feeling the tension of the last hour settling into her bones, and allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding: she'd never really stopped being Viper. The call sign wasn't something you earned through service and then discarded when you left, it was who you became through accumulated survival, and it stayed with you whether you wore the uniform or not. 3 years of anonymity had been an illusion, a temporary invisibility that circumstances had finally stripped away. She was a legend whether she wanted to be or not, and tonight had proven that legends couldn't stay hidden when crisis required the expertise that made them legendary. It was the fundamental paradox of her existence: the more skilled you became at saving lives, the less possible it became to live quietly among those whose lives would never require extraordinary intervention. She closed her eyes, letting exhaustion begin the process of recovery, and thought about the businessman in 23C who'd forgotten her face minutes after conversation, who now would never forget the ordinary-appearing passenger who'd saved his life. That transformation, from invisible to unforgettable, was complete. She was seen now, truly seen, in ways that would make normal existence impossible for however long the recognition persisted. But 174 people were alive. And in the end, that was the only metric that mattered. That was the burden and the gift of being extraordinary. You couldn't choose when circumstances would require your expertise, but you could choose whether to use it when crisis arrived. She'd made her choice. And now she'd live with the consequences, whatever they might be. Viper was home, whether she'd wanted to come home or not. And somewhere in the sky above, F-35 pilots were returning to base carrying the story of how one of aviation's greatest legends had emerged from anonymity to save 174 lives using tactics they'd only seen in classified briefings. That story would spread through military aviation communities worldwide, would become part of the oral tradition that shaped how pilots understood excellence and expertise and the burden of possessing capabilities that exceeded normal boundaries. She tried to disappear. Circumstances had found her anyway. And now she'd figure out how to exist in the space between legend and human, between extraordinary capability and ordinary desire for peace. It wouldn't be easy. But nothing worth doing ever was. The vehicle carried her toward whatever came next, leaving behind the scene of her exposure and the aircraft she'd saved and the survivors who'd never forget the mysterious passenger who turned out to be anything but ordinary. And in the quiet darkness of the back seat, Alex Kincaid, call sign Viper, began the process of accepting that some identities couldn't be abandoned, that some expertise created obligations that lasted beyond service, and that sometimes the only way to remain human while being legendary was to accept both truths as inseparable parts of the same complex existence. She'd saved 174 lives tonight. Tomorrow she'd face the consequences. And somehow, she'd find a way to keep living despite being unable to return to the invisibility that had made civilian life possible. Because that's what legends did: they survived, they adapted, and they carried the burden of their extraordinary capabilities through whatever circumstances emerged, whether chosen or imposed. And in the end, that was enough. It had to be.